Good evening, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here. I'm really honored that Wendy asked me to launch her project, which has been running, in theory, and running in parallel with the Frank Lloyd Wright exhibition, but I think you're going to discover over the course of the evening that it has been running in parallel with many, many things here at the museum and making connections across curatorial projects. And as far as working with Wendy, for me, it actually goes back to the first day I was at MoMA and started to talk about the Bauhaus as a place that integrates media and goes across boundaries between the idea of displaying and the idea of doing and education. So this evening is a wonderful beginning of an experiment called the People's Studio, Design, Experiment, Build. It's been planned by the Education Department in timing as a complement to the Frank Lloyd Wright show that Jennifer Gray and I have co-curated, and along with a cast of about a dozen other individual curators, two of whom are here tonight, at least I've seen so far. But it also relates, of course, to the Rauschenberg show, which is on view right now, Black Mountain College. But that leads us immediately back to Bauhaus Workshops for Modernity in 2009. So this is an evening that really ties together many strains. I wasn't so sure what my role was, so I put together a couple of slides, and I hope you'll forgive me if I free associate a little bit in setting up what tonight's speakers are going to do. I'm not going to introduce them per se, because happily now at MoMA we have what I call the prayer manual, order of prayer. It has the hymns, it has biographical information on those who will be enlightening us. So there are three presentations tonight, as you know, on Black Mountain College, on Victor D'Amico, who's a fascinating figure here at MoMA, and of course on yet another very unusual educational experiment, but very simultaneously innovative and influential, and that is the architecture and design education that took place peripatetically between the two Taliesins of Frank Lloyd Wright, from whence the materials that are on view upstairs come. So this is the image that went up today on the MoMA website of learning by making and manipulating forms. It seems to us so commonplace right now that I just wanted to start and do what professors do. They do huge, big scale contextualizations. And let's see if I can do this. To say that I think that these case studies take their place tonight in relationship to the absolute intertwining of the development of modern art, modern design, modern architecture, the whole experiment that we think of as the avant-gardes and their legacies, the neo-avant-gardes from the late 19th century on, and educational experiments go hand in hand. So on the larger scale things, I just thought to remind you that until well into the 19th century, it was commonly accepted that artistic education was about imitating models in nature. And so what we're going to look at tonight are three episodes that try to find ways to absolutely break with the century-old traditions of the art academies, where one drew from the live model or from nature, as well as art education, as much as it even existed before the 20th century, art education of children, which was essentially a form, to be a little bit Marxist here, which was essentially a form to create art workers out of children. So here we see the children at the École Gratuite de Dessin in Paris, which was a school for working class children. It's been very much celebrated for the fact that it moved attention from the drawing of the human figure towards natural forms, towards nature. It's been very much associated with the emergence of the Art Nouveau and Jugendstil, but primarily it was creating a cadre of extremely young art workers to work in industry and to decorate objects and to make the link between the industrial fabrication of things and that part of the human hand that was still required. So we could say that this was the situation in art education across ages at the dawn of the period that interests us, which I think takes us back really to the 1890s. And it should be said that there is an enormous amount of research that's coming together, but I think that tonight will also bear witness to the fact that for the most part, it has taken the form of individual case studies. And one of the things I find interesting about tonight's conversation is to begin to weave connections across experiments, across figures, and indeed across continents. There's a book. I'm going to shamelessly advertise somebody else's book. There is a book that is pending. I have read the manuscript, and it's coming out in the fall by Zeynep Selik-Alexander that I think would be the absolute prerequisite reading for tonight were it already available. And this is called Kinesthetic Knowing, Aesthetics, Epistemology, Modern Design. It's coming out from the University of Chicago. And it reminds us that even these famous incidents that we're about to look at take place in a larger context of not only inquiry about how what is the role of art education, but in a huge epistemological shift about what it means to know, about the fact of visual knowledge as having equal standing to literary and written knowledge, and about the relationship in particular to the manipulation of hands, but also to the movements of bodies and space as something that is a form of knowledge as much as a form of expression. There's also, of course, an enormous literature that has looked at the rise of abstraction in painting in relationship to educational experiments. And what becomes very interesting there is often the educational experiments precede by decades the manifestations. So as much as if you're an art historian, Kandinsky's exercises on the triangle, part of the Bauhaus preliminary course, here from about 1925, these particular examples seem to be an initiatory moment in the creation of the Bauhaus. They can in fact be traced back to theories about kindergarten, has been established by many people, for about 75 years earlier. Or, of course, the Young People's Museum here at MoMA in 1937, and I just had to juxtapose these smaller hands playing with triangles here, that Wendy is going to tell us a great deal about this evening, and which she has been researching, and that's one of the great joys of working with her, that she has as much fascination for the history of the institution, but also a belief that it plays a productive role in what we do now, not simply an antiquarian knowledge about those who come before us. But it also reminds us that in the American context, museums were associated with education from the very beginning. Education departments were an extremely important part of museums, often museums that would collect copies and were not obsessed with originals. So there's a very long history of museum education, parallel to that kindergarten movement. And I want also to stress the fact, I think tonight we're going to pay a great deal of attention to the originator of kindergarten, to Friedrich Froebel, because he connects not only the Bauhaus, but also to the early education of Frank Lloyd Wright. Now, this is something of a mystery. I'll turn to that in a moment. I think it's been a little bit mythologized. But I just want to say, had I more time, I want to interweave in right now the fact that we talk mostly about a set of very powerful institutions that have had an enormous influence, but they overshadow countless experiments from the 1890s on. And I'm just showing you two major figures here, Wilhelm von Debschitz on the left, August Endel, a architect on the right. On either side of 1900, they set up private schools. So there's a whole history that's beginning to emerge. Zeynep Selik is going to be one place to find them, to find these institutions of private schools that critiqued the status quo, that critiqued the academy, and which shared in common, of course you always share in common, which shared the desire to find some form of underlying form generator that would liberate art education, art thinking, whether it was for making or appreciating, from a belief in imitation, in the emulation of that which existed, to the creation of the unprecedented, but still always wanting to tie it to some underlying logic of form. So it really is in August Endel, in this plate from about 1902, that we see some of the first projections of a completely abstract, non-referential architecture. And so that relationship between theories of education and form becomes particularly dramatic when, as I juxtapose these two slides that have spent a lot of time together in many different PowerPoints, before that in slide projectors, and that is one of the pages from Froebel's how-to manual for how to use the gifts, although the gifts were meant to liberate imagination. Being that Froebel was German, they were not to liberate it beyond rules. They were based in a set of procedures and a set of rules that should become innate for a very young user. Frank Lloyd Wright always claimed that the Froebel blocks were something that he had been given as a very young child, that his mother had found it in the educational exhibition at the Philadelphia Centennial Exhibition in 1876, and it was this that allowed him to see his way to a completely unprecedented new architecture. This is probably largely a myth. He may very well have had those blocks, but the truth of the matter, as Joseph Connors argued many years ago, was that his wife, first wife, set up a kindergarten in the home and studio in Oak Park, and she obtained educational toys of this like at about the time that Wright was beginning his professional practice. Nonetheless, it is extremely compelling, particularly in that demonstration of the way that some of the more advanced gifts might be used in the center on the right to juxtapose that once again with the elemental form making and the playing with symmetries and dynamic asymmetries in Wright's Unity Temple, which is on exhibit upstairs. Now, had we had more time, I would love to have a fourth example. This is a thing that I long someday to do an exhibition on, to revive the incredible artistic experiment that took place around the garden city of Hellerau outside of Dresden in the opening years of the 20th century. In fact, many of the major protagonists that we're going to hear about in relationship to the Bauhaus had direct connections to this colony, and particularly its artistic center, much of which centered here on the Festhaus, designed by the German architect Heinrich Tessenau. Now, not only is that architecture look itself like a Froebelian product, but most extraordinarily inside a experiment between stage design, spatial design, and choreography took place on a regular basis. It was here that, for instance, Ludwig Mies van der Rohe would meet his wife, who was a dancer here. And I bring this up because I think one of the things that becomes very compelling in these artistic experiments, circa 1900, is a relationship between not simply form making, but the spatial, the experiential, through not simply vision, but also the body, and performance. And I'm sure we'll hear a bit about this with Wendy, but it's interesting and often forgotten that the Museum of Modern Art had in the early days also a theater department. So the role of performance and the body acting in space is something that has a much longer history, even in this institution, than the recent establishment of a Department of Performance Art. So the type of expressive dancing that took place on the stage at Hellerau. So many of these traditions, incredible stage designs that played with the relationship of light to abstract form and experience, down to these extraordinary watercolors by the designer Adolf Appia. So in closing, let's segue to an integrating place for all of us, and that is the Bauhaus, particularly the Bauhaus, which remained a generative for the imaginary, not only for art making, but for educational institutions after its dramatic closure by the Nazis in 1933. It's forgotten in some ways that the 1938 show here at MoMA, this is in fact not in MoMA, but in the concourse level of Rockefeller Center, MoMA, the MoMA building was under construction, and in a certain way preparing for that new experimental museum taking up its residence in its new home on its 10th anniversary, was prepared in the Bauhaus exhibition downstairs from the commercial establishment of Rockefeller Center. But it was also precisely at that moment that D'Amico launches the Young People's Gallery. So this parallelism between education and the experimental production of art is dramatized in the juxtaposition of already programming of exhibition and one of the great innovators on museum education, reaching not an audience that's sustained over a long period, but even the idea of the temporary student from the visitor or for children who might take a short range of classes. And from that, this is one of the most extraordinary installations ever created by Herbert Bayer through those show windows. But I picked this image. The images themselves are extraordinary works because of the deliberate juxtaposition here of the model of the Bauhaus building with a hanging exercise from the preliminary course. And I think that the point of this exhibition was that the Bauhaus was a method of education. It was a method of making, seeing, and doing, and it was not a style. And therefore, although in a way this was a funereal exercise to celebrate a institution that had been killed 5 years earlier, to celebrate it in the face of the degenerate art activities in Germany. Here's Herbert Bayer, the designer, with his recreations of the lost preliminary course projects, these elemental works in paper. The walls as well laid out the educational philosophy, which was one both for the art viewer but also for the art maker. And in a way, it was a kind of attempt at resurrection. So it's often forgotten that the show celebrated as well those institutions that might revivify and bring to free America the suppressed experiments of the Bauhaus. So here the short-lived Laboratory School of Industrial Design. I'd like to think it's being reborn tonight, actually, up on the third floor. So I just conclude with in 2009 when Leah Dickerman and I curated this exhibition, Bauhaus Workshops for Modernity. We've split now. She's doing Rauschenberg. I'm doing Right with Jennifer, but I think that this already announced to our commitment to not only the history of innovative artistic education, but the fact that that education, as much as the viewing of objects in a museum setting, would be part of the display. Somebody who works with you, Wendy, sent me this slide, and it brought back wonderful memories of the invitation you gave. That's me, the one with the dome-like head towards the bottom, of inviting Addie Gropius. Addie Gropius was the daughter of Walter Gropius, as she still is, and she was a museum educator. She herself was trained at Black Mountain College, was a museum educator in the suburbs of Boston for many years, and she came down and gave us a one-day example of how the preliminary course worked. There we all are doing the old exercise of how radically can you transform a sheet of paper with the fewest number of interventions, at once a physical and a mental exercise, and then the critique and discussion of them that takes place afterwards. So it is in continuity of that the People's Laboratory now brings this right into the spaces of the museum, reconfigures the curtain wall that you see across the garden, and reminds us of that intimate relationship between the experiments that the museum collects in the history of art and the ongoing experiments of artistic education. So with that, I will turn it over to you to begin the moderation. Thank you very much.
Hi, that was amazing. So I'm Ellen Lupton. I'm a guest here tonight. I'm a curator at Cooper-Hewitt Smithsonian Design Museum, and I'm really honored to be here to be your moderator. And so my job is to introduce our next three amazing speakers. I will not read from the prayer book, but their names alone have the quality of biblical genealogies. Their titles at their esteemed institutions. So they're each going to talk for 10 minutes. And then we're going to have a wonderful response to their talks. And then, with the time and energy remaining, we're going to reassemble in these waiting chairs and get casual and talk about ideas. And most of all, hear from you, questions from you. So first, Jennifer Gray will talk about Frank Lloyd Wright's Taliesin, a school of architecture that viewed its students as apprentices or staff, which is very much not how contemporary art schools view their students. As a faculty member, I'm aware these are my customers. Jennifer is project research assistant here in the Department of Architecture and Design at the Museum of Modern Art. and she is adjunct assistant professor in the Graduate School of Architecture at Columbia University. Eva Díaz will talk about 3 artists who taught at Black Mountain College, Joseph Albers, John Cage, and Buckminster Fuller. Each of them explored what it means to experiment in art education. Eva is Associate Professor of History of Art and Design at Pratt Institute. Wendy Woon will discuss MoMA's historic role forging new ideas about art education in the context of a museum, the museum as an educational space. Wendy is the Edward John Noble Foundation Deputy Director for Education here at MoMA. Carol Becker will respond to these presentations. She is a writer and educator who is grappling now with the future of those ideas that were set into motion by these earlier institutions. So what next? Carol is Professor of the Arts and Dean, Columbia University School of the Arts. So we're going to get started and then have some conversation. So come on up.
So I get to be the first to live up to this biblical legacy that allegedly I'm the heir to. So I'll see if I can live up to that. In addition to that, I have to admit I'm a bit of an imposter. I'm here to talk about Taliesin, but I never went to Taliesin as a student. I know we have at least one Taliesin fellow in the audience, so hopefully a friend of mine, hopefully you can chime in, and also a guest scholar that helped us with the exhibition. So I'm approaching this really from the standpoint of pedagogical history and theory, which is something I've worked on for quite a long time in my own work in terms of progressive education, the relationship to schools, not necessarily architecture schools. And I thought I would step back by giving a broad view about what Taliesin as a place is, because even for myself as an architecture student, you hear all about it, but what exactly is it? Is it a school? Is it a residence? It's also a farm. It's actually an alternative community of sorts. It exists in multiple locations. The first one is founded in Wisconsin on the Lloyd Jones family farmland in Wisconsin, Franklin Wright's family. He built a second outpost in Arizona in the late 1930s. The fellowship itself was founded in the early 1930s, 1932-33, and he actually jokes that there's 2 others. He has an annex, a studio apartment residence, while he's building the Imperial Hotel in Tokyo, and then he also takes up residence at Taliesin IV, the Taliesin IV, in the plaza when he's building the Guggenheim. So, but I'm only going to talk about the main 2, but point being the sort of location of these places and how they migrate back and forth is quite important, and I thought I would illustrate that not with slides, but by showing some excerpts from some films, home movies really, that we digitized as part of the Franklin Wright exhibition. There's about 271 homemade films, mostly homemade films. Some of them are a bit more professionalized that exist in the archive. We've just begun the task of trying to view them and digitize them and conserve them. So I'm only sort of cribbing from the 15 that we've been able to look so far, but it gives you a sense of the actual place moving in space and time. So if we could play the first clip, I'm starting with Taliesin East. There's no sound, so you're not missing an audio soundtrack here. So you can see, even just, these are very brief clips, they're probably about 45 seconds long, but you really can get a sense of what the landscape in Taliesin is like. This, of course, is during the summer months. It's very fertile, it's very rich, it still today is being actively used as a farm. In fact, Wright was one of the first to engage with contour farming in the early part of the 20th century, which is more sustainable environmentally way of farming. I liked this clip because it shows how he's receiving visitors here. So again, it's not just a school where you go and study architecture. It really is. People live there on site. It's a community. The dog in the foreground here is a fixture at these early Taliesins, and I have to admit that in the finding aid for the films, for the longest time we were trying to figure out this one name, and I'm actually blanking what it is. It's Carla or Charlie or something, but we couldn't figure it out, and it turns out it's a dog. So it was actually in the inventory. But I like to stop here. The film kind of cuts off here, but just to showcase there's a child there, there's visitors, there's families here. So Taliesin was actually in a place where people would meet each other, they would get married, they might have children there. Some of them still work and live there. Some of the original traditional fellows do. And the first time I went to Taliesin West, I was given a tour by a Taliesin baby, it was called, which is someone who was born at Taliesin and continues to be engaged with the site today. So I wanted to give you a little snippet into how it's not just an architecture school, but it really is meant to be an alternative community of sorts. Just to give you some background about Taliesin East in particular, Wright had a long association with this landscape. He would work summers on his uncle's farm in the Lloyd-Jones family. They farmed that land for many, many, many decades before Taliesin was even founded, and I'll come back to that at the end. One of Wright's very first architectural commissions was for the Hillside Homeschool at Taliesin. So even before the Taliesin Fellowship was founded in 1932, he's engaging with that space, and of course he built his own home and residence in 1911, 1912, the very first Taliesin, before there even is a fellowship. He takes up residence there. So he's always sort of interacting with this environment over time. And let me move it forward. I'll play you one more from Taliesin West. Okay, can you play this one, please? Sorry. So this is Taliesin West. It's in Scottsdale. It's in Arizona. Wright had started visiting the American Southwest in the late 1920s. He ends up moving there part of the year, partly for health reasons. And for a period of time, they're living in temporary accommodations called the Ocatilla Desert Camp. Some of you know this. These are kind of like permanent tent sites in a sense. And essentially, he built a more permanent residence in the late 1930s, and that's what you're looking at here. He's in his prime here with his outfit and his hat. You might recognize him by this point. But Taliesin West, the apprentices, as they were called, which I think immediately harkens all kinds of connections to the Bauhaus. The students there were also called apprentices. So the fellowship was founded in 1932-33, which is when the actual apprentices come into practice, or come into play. He had hired other architects to be his associates, often licensed and trained architects, I should say, in the early part of the 20th century. So he's always had students and workers in his studio, but in this case, I should say they are not just apprentices, they are also consumers and customers. It was a fee-paid, tuition-paying student body here, and I should add that it was twice as expensive to go to Taliesin as it was to go to UPenn when it first opened. So this was not a cheap school to attend. When you arrived, however, you were given residence, you were given food. It's an entire communal lifestyle, as I'll get back to, so perhaps it was worth it. And I think it's also worth noting that this was happening in the early 1930s, early to mid-1930s, during the Great Depression. So the idea of having a place to live in a productive landscape to raise your own food. Much of the building here is self-built by the students, so it's a type of masonry constructed. They can learn to build architecture by actually building it. So all of this feeds into the curriculum and pedagogy of the Taliesins. So I tried to sort of show some slides here that we, are not showing the exhibition that maybe none of you have seen before. The Frank Lloyd Wright Archive has hundreds, literally 100,000 photographs. Many of them are unprocessed at this point. And just very recently, I came across many photographs showing Taliesin fellows at work at Taliesin. So I thought I'd share them with you for the very first time. You can see many of them are in photo albums that are in varying degrees of, conservation status. Some of them have ripped edges. Some of the albums, unfortunately, have been taken apart. But overwhelmingly, when you look at the images, you'll see that the apprentices are engaged with the landscape. They're often farming, they're gardening. In terms of architectural design, it was very common to draw abstractions from the natural landscape, which is something, if you go to the exhibition, I think also in the studio, there are programs and exercises to this effect. So there's the one hand an engagement with an actual productive landscape, but also looking at the landscape from an abstract point of view, not unlike the exercises in geometric abstraction that would have been happening at something like the Bauhaus. So here's just a few shots to go through. I'm not sure who the apprentice on the left is, but he makes a cameo in many of these photographs. I'll have to try and figure it out. But you can see on the right, they're using machinery. On the right-hand side, they're engaged with hewing logs. This is more log splitting. Here again, operating factory, or operating agricultural machinery. Who is it? Yen Liang. Here's my the person who probably should be giving this talk. Here's farming. Again, a goat on the left-hand side. On the right-hand side, working in the construction processes. Again, actually self-building oftentimes at the Taliesins. This is Taliesin East. I brought in the connection to weaving because, again, many of these schools engage the types of hands-on learning that are being practiced often correlate, I think. There's often the same activities happening. So weaving is happening at the Taliesins as well. And I, in particular, wanted to focus on weaving, because for Frank Lloyd Wright, weaving is not just a practical exercise to learn certain skills. It's a lifelong metaphor that he engages. So if you read the autobiography, for example, or other writings, or even poetry that he's quoting from, he often talks about weaving as a type of metaphor for the integration of sort of life and work and the cosmos. He calls himself the weaver, as a matter of fact, and he spends much of his life perfecting a system of construction that nowadays is often theorized as the textile tectonic, where concrete blocks would be cast eventually by the late 1950s by the owners of a house themselves. So again, engaging in DIY construction processes, but they would be cast and woven together with reinforced steel rods. So the theme of weaving is not just about a kind of practical exercise to learn design activities, but also one that has metaphorical resonance with Wright. Just a few more shots. That's Frank Lloyd Wright actually on the far right-hand side. Actually, I think I probably have a pointer right there. And lastly, printing was always a long-term engagement of the Taliesins in their various locations. There was still a printing press at Taliesin East, a very large one. If you go there, and I just brought in a very kind of two images here, sample of some of the many types of printings that the Taliesin apprentices engaged with. These are called the square papers, the Taliesin square papers, partly a reference to the fact that the paper itself is a perfect square and then it unfolds into sort of a broadside of sorts. And you probably can't read from this distance, but what it says on the front cover there is a non-political voice in our democratic minority. And I think just that title alone speaks a lot about the printing, not only as an activity, but how Frank Lloyd Wright viewed self-printing. This is something they're doing at Taliesin as a form of politics and engaging with social change. So these would have been distributed with his own political theories, and of course in his mind this is the democratic political theories that he's spreading in contrast to what he would criticize big government and media and things like this. But he's really using printing as a type of democratic exercise. And I should note, I've got my 2-minute cue here, but printing for him was always an interest since his seminal lecture in 1901 called The Art and Craft of the Machine. He gives this lecture at Hull House, which is another very important tie-in to Taliesin. He's engaged with the settlement community, Jane Addams, John Dewey, the laboratory school, and in 1901 he quotes Victor Hugo and says basically the argument that this will kill that, the printing press will kill the edifice. And one of the benefits of the printing press in this logic is that unlike building, the printing press democratizes access to knowledge. It's distributable, you can reproduce it, you don't have to travel to a certain site, it's not so site-specific. So he engages with printing throughout his entire career. This is just more towards the end as a way to advance his democratic social ideas beyond architecture. And lastly here, this is a typical weekday in the Taliesin Fellowship. So you can see someone described as monastic at the beginning here. This we actually found, you can see the date on this is 1956, so it's a bit of a summary and perhaps an idealization of what actually happened. We found it in the same box that contained the Mile High Skyscraper press release information. So he's obviously trying to exhibit Taliesin in some senses along with this large press conference and exhibition he had for another project. So the school itself is on display, you might call it that. Exhibiting a curriculum, of course, is always a problem. It's maybe not as visual, but you can see it's very routine. Breakfast happens at a certain time. The apprentices themselves are engaged in cooking and cleaning up afterwards. They still do that to this day, the people that live there. There's chorus rehearsal. Gardening is at 8:45. This is mandatory. Everyone has to go into the landscape and engage in some way with farming, gardening, weeding, hoeing, and whatnot. In terms of design processes, at 9:30, it's divided into design processes and construction processes. So you might see there's a bit of the form learning and also the actual making of the architecture. And he's very clear that the apprentices would engage in all aspects of construction: plumbing, woodworking, millwork, this kind of thing. So it's really meant to be a school where all aspects of design could be embraced. And later in the afternoon, there's tea. And I should mention that at Taliesin East, there is a tea circle where people would gather together, and the idea of the circle as being a space of democratic egalitarian exchange because everyone is sitting at the circle. And then further towards the end of the day, I guess there's more free time, so to speak, but philosophy is brought into play, theater, music, films and such. So really you get the sense that the community, it's about living and working and eating and producing food together and entertainment together and sharing thoughts and ideas and politics all together, not just an architecture school. So I'll leave it at that because I'm running out of my 10 minutes. We can carry it on, but I had a few just slides here that I'll offer as teasers that we can talk about. I tried to do kind of a backward look into what might have inspired something like the Taliesin Fellowship for Frank Lloyd Wright. His family is long time engaged in progressive education, going back to the settlement movement. His uncle, Jenkin Lloyd Jones, All Souls Church, eventually becomes a settlement house. They actually separate from the Unitarian ministry. Here's Lloyd Jones Valley before it's ever Taliesin, again, a farm. Here's Hillside Homeschool. This is the school of Franklin Wright design, progressive education, again, before Taliesin. So all of these are feeding beyond Froebel blocks and the kind of mythologies we hear about that. All of these are actually, I would say, more to the point, feeding into something like a Taliesin than these. And he himself writes about the Froebel blocks. I mean, Wright is a master of crafting his own themes, but these, I think, are probably more where he's getting it from. So we can talk in more detail, but just some leitmotifs. I'll talk about that later. All right, I think Eva's next.
Hello. So normally I wouldn't read a talk this short, but I'm due next week. So the organizers were very anxious that I give them a talk in case I wasn't going to be here and someone else would read it. So I figure since it's already written out, we'll just do it that way. So let me just begin by saying that the relationship of creativity and progressive education at Black Mountain is a really big topic. And here we have an image of students building the studies building at the Black Mountain Lake Eating campus in 1940-41, which is held up as a kind of art learning life moment. And after having published a book, and here's a little plug, about the conflicted nature of experimentation in art and pedagogy at the college, we don't have the time to parse all of the matters in that book in detail, but what I do want to do with the time we have today is to briefly consider the 3 case studies in teaching at Black Mountain of Joseph Albers, John Cage, and Buckminster Fuller that point to how models of experimental art practice associated with testing, innovation, and collaboration were sometimes in tension with issues of authorship and the intergenerational transmission of knowledge and aspirations toward progressive pedagogy, which I define in terms of progressive pedagogy as learning at both the individual and societal level, as personal growth coupled with social political transformation. So just to jump right in, Joseph Albers didn't look for solutions, political or otherwise, but instead posed questions about the nature and understanding of form. His technique of testing subtle distinctions in vision used basic forms as containers for variation. Though this work of comparison was sometimes deemed too subtle and restrained, Clement Greenberg, in particular, bestowed the faint commendation that Albers' quote, strictly rectilinear art adheres to the dogma of the straight line. And this was not the first time that Albers' artistic method had been characterized as rigid or repetitive, or for that matter, his teaching dismissed as doctrinaire. The testimony of his students, though, often refuted such claims, but they recognized that as a pedagogue, Albers trained them not to produce work that looked like his own, but with the help of this methodology of experimentation to represent the world liberated from sterile habit. Years after his studies at Black Mountain, Robert Rauschenberg praised Albers' method. Here's the long quote from Rauschenberg. "I'm still learning what he taught me, because what he taught had to do with the entire visual world. He didn't teach you to do art. When he taught watercolor, for example, he taught the specific properties of watercolor, not how to make a good watercolor picture. When he taught drawing, he taught the efficient functioning of line. Color was about the flexibilities and the complex relationships that colors have to one another. I consider Albers the most important teacher I've ever had, and I'm sure he considered me one of his poorest students." And when asked about this, about Rauschenberg's comments in an interview, Albers responded, "We were not on great admiring terms with each other, Rauschenberg. He was a little stubborn and doing his own thing. But what he's doing now," and this is from the late 60s, "is much more a part of my class he participated in than he will ever recognize. At Black Mountain, combination was a great word in our vocabulary, and changing surface qualities, changing of articulation, that was a very exciting study at Black Mountain. And I think that's what lives on in his work now. That's the end of the quote. For Albers, a determined process of experimentation produced results whereby contingency, the carefully tested permutations of a form's appearance that can continually be subjected to new variations, could be most clearly maintained. The understanding of contingency as what he called trial and error experimentation, with the endless possibility of methodically testing difference, was both a pedagogical practice and a methodology guiding his own artwork. And this type of experimentation, what I termed in my book his ethics, Albers' ethics of perception, serves as an important impetus to perceptual and possibly cognitive change. Indeed, he believed it can, and this is his quote, his words, it can lead to new illusions, to new relationships, to different measurements, to other systems. I'm just going to jump right to John Cage. Sorry for the kind of haste of this, but I just wanted to kind of think about these moments of conflict in terms of teaching and art practice at the college. And there would be many more than just these 3 case studies, but just to give you a sort of overview of what was happening at Black Mountain in the late 40s in particular. So John Cage's model of experimentation spurned purposeful communication between artist and audience, positing such an exchange as the obsolete habit of imposing predictable regularity on both the audience's interpretive freedom and on what he considered the underlying fundamental unknowable organization of nature. In this proposal of indeterminacy, Cage argued that a new dimension of perception could be revealed outside human faculties of organization and intention. These are his words, not an attempt to bring order out of chaos, nor to suggest improvements in creation, but simply a way of waking up to the very life we're living, which is so excellent once one gets one's mind and one's desires out of the way and let it act of its own accord. Cage's method of experimentation underwent many transformations in his long life, and what's pertinent to a study of Cage at Black Mountain is the way he used his really quite brief time at the college as a testing ground for his rapidly maturing ideas about how to prolong the creative process of experimentation to generate unpredictable compositions, and how to extend this new process to a work's reception in performance situations with unfixed outcomes. And on his 1952 teaching stint at the college, he radically disrupted previous incarnations of performance by introducing overlapping activities and narrative fragmentation, producing theater piece number 1, also known as The First Happening. In this work, Cage recruited faculty and students, including Robert Rauschenberg, to perform short-time scripts, resulting in many unrelated events dispersed through the performance space that could not be seen together at one time. To Cage, the event represented what he called the centricity within each event and its non-dependence on other events. Though he had in fact established strict time brackets and organized the event with particular temporal and locational guidelines. Cage's employment of what I have termed a chance protocol, seemingly paradoxical phrase, in theater piece, one of these particular parameters like duration, the assignment of specific tasks to performers, or an agreed upon use of certain tools or instruments governing the execution of the work, represented his attempt to sever experimentation from determining factors such as artistic intention or argumentation. So in contrast to Albers' long association with Black Mountain as a teacher and artist, Cage's own work in this vein overshadowed his actual teaching there, which at least during his Black Mountain years was quite underdeveloped. When, for example, he found students unwilling to enroll in his summer 1952 class, the stated goal of which was to apprentice helpers to do the tedious work of cutting and splicing bits of magnetic tape for the composition Williams mix, he canceled all formal teaching for the term. His tenure at the college, though, is most closely associated with these performance events like The Happening, and the way he formulated them into a new and persuasive model of experimentation that only later became the basis for an influential pedagogy, particularly when he taught in the later 50s at the New School from 56 to 58 and sort of birthed Fluxus wholesale. in his experimental composition class there. And just as a kind of final look at Black Mountain, through a case study of the method of experimentation of Buckminster Fuller and what he termed comprehensive design. And he was only beginning to articulate this as he accepted what was his first ever teaching commission at Black Mountain, ever at Black Mountain in the summer of '48. And it was an invitation to come at a moment that was a quite low moment for Fuller in terms of his career. But after his time at the college, education subsequently became a major prong of Fuller's public self-definition, and with pedagogy's role in initiating claims for social justice becomes the chief preoccupation of his life and voluminous writings. But conflicts about authorship and his students' engineering innovations caused Fuller to enforce strict hierarchies when working on college campuses in the future, and Fuller took to licensing his protégés for any work done after his courses. You can see a Dymaxion license from 1949 that authorizes a student, for example, to produce one geodesic dome after taking his class for free. So when he arrived at Black Mountain in '48, Fuller began collaborating with college student Kenneth Snelson in developing what Fuller termed tensegrity, which is an engineering principle of discontinuous compression and continuous tension. Just to kind of think about post-lintel architecture, where there's a lot of compression going on and not a lot of tension distributed. You have a sort of post bearing a lot of weight. A tensegrity system creates a tensile system that disperses the load. And that was really the innovation of Snelson's X-piece sculpture that you see here that he produced in Fuller's class in '48. And so this idea of tensegrity derived from a work's integrity, which is its structural stability, and maintained through a pervasive tensional force. So this load is distributed through the nylon wire's tension, rigging the top figure to balance upright as the thin wires box the exterior of the X's to keep the forms oriented at this exact right angle. And so the tensegrity principle disperses compressive elements, creating an internal energy system that strengthens synergistically, another Fuller neologism, with the addition of further elements. So, for example, it makes a radio tower stand up without a lot of struts as a tensegrity system. So these developments of Fuller and Snelson's in tensegrity precipitated the construction of a 20-foot, well, hopefully they hoped it would be 20-foot high, geodesic dome at the college, influenced by X-piece. So one damp morning, after an extensive series of pre-computer era calculations, dozens of commercially available Venetian blind sats were assembled as the dome's armature. And the dome, unsurprisingly, failed to rise and was termed the supine dome. So according to Fuller, he was aware that the Venetian blinds would have needed to have been doubled up in order to have sufficient tensile strength to elevate the dome. But he decided to push ahead with the insufficient materials he had at hand so as to demonstrate that structures could be gradually built up to the point of standing in order to create materially and economically efficient buildings, which is really an amazing and very influential model of ad hoc architecture. Take what you have and sort of test and see until you have enough. For him, lightness was a prime feature of the dome's design, and he stated, "I want to build a building that they're not afraid to have it collapse because it's so light it can't hurt anyone. It's like confetti." So just briefly in conclusion, to take up these cases at Black Mountain posits a close interrelationship of experimentation in art or in form production and education, and suggests that working experimentally in a cultural practice, in these cases art, architecture, music, theater, has a shadow venture, a project of posing models how to test and organize new forms of agency and social life, none the least of which is the relationship between teachers and students. So as different as their pedagogical strategies were, the attribution of a common experimental basis to all of these different methods to their inventions and their reinterpretations of tradition brings to the fore the shared impulse of each teacher to change present and future conditions for themselves and their students. I mean, one would not experiment if the current state of affairs, the status quo, was perceived as satisfactory. And this extension of the project of artistic experimentation to a redefinition of the conditions of life and learning is, of course, as fraught as those preceding it in early moments of 20th century modernism. So, thank you.
So, why, you may ask, are we considering MoMA alongside the places that champion progressive art education such as Taliesin Fellowship and Black Mountain College? Well, settlement houses and museums and other places of informal learning played important roles in experimentation with, development of, and dissemination about progressive art education in the first half of the 20th century. And as you can see, this is a mapping of an ecosystem of influence. And so my intent is to more share the museum's history as a context for experimentation, experimental art education that's helped foster new communities of art enthusiasts and a few artists. Although many of you are familiar with the narrative of the Museum of Modern Art's first director, Alfred H. Barr, described a laboratory for modern art and exhibit making, but what's not commonly known is that it was a place of experimentation with modern art pedagogy. Starting in 1937, MoMA was an urban lab for testing out and modeling new concepts in teaching art supported by exceptional design of creative teaching methods and learning environments. The museum took a leadership role in art education as a convener and a disseminator of new ideas about art, its use in civic life, and innovative art teaching. All these initiatives fostered communities of learners that some still recall the most intimate details after a half a century. The untold story is now possible to unpack because the archives from the first 32 years of MoMA's education department were returned and made publicly accessible in MoMA archives. In 1937, Victor D'Amico was hired by MoMA to head up a 2-year experiment, the Educational Project. An experienced and imaginative art educator who had worked in settlement houses, D'Amico headed the art department at the Progressive Fieldson schools. Interestingly, he'd also worked for set and industrial designer Norman Belgedes. And with D'Amico, attention to design and supportive pedagogy is as a distinguishing characteristic of his legacy. His philosophy about people and art was rooted in the theories of John Dewey, and he championed art as experience and teaching aimed at developing the creative potential of the individual. Prior to starting at MoMA, and supported by the Rockefeller Fund, he traveled widely across the nation, observing art in schools from 1935 to 36. His final report, Art in American Schools, afforded him a broad perspective on the state of the arts education, a significant base of knowledge to draw upon at MoMA. As part of the study, he visited Black Mountain College, and he interviewed director John Andrew Rice, Annie Albers, and Joseph Albers. And after observing many of Joseph's classes, he summarized, "So many convincing and lucid theories fall short of their practice. I question the Black Mountain Plan in both principle and practice, though I feel there is much to be learned and prized in the plan." He took issue with the scientific and intellectual approach of Albers, which he noted defeated Rice's claim of developing the emotional outlet, noting the student never does work without abandon. Yet this didn't stop him from inviting Annie Albers and Joseph Albers to teach at MoMA, nor did it stop Albers from inviting D'Amico to teach in the summer of 1944 at Black Mountain College. So an important part of the legacy of both D'Amico and the Museum of Modern Art were 22 years of annual national convenings, 1942 to 1964, of the Committee on Art Education, whose purpose was art for all for the purpose of fuller living. This gathering was a range of thinkers and artists and educators, including Walter Gropius, Waldo Frank, Hale Woodruff, Victor Lowenfeld, Bell Boas, Marcel Brewer, Robert Motherwell, and Ben Shahn, amongst other keynote speakers. And the committee was organized with meetings with artists like Buckminster Fuller and Juan Miro, Martha Graham, Edward Hopper, Georgia O'Keeffe, Alexander Calder, Marc Chagall, William Zorich, José de Krefft, and Henri Cartier-Bresson. Interestingly, Agnes Martin actually did the recordings for those sessions. A few weeks after Frank Lloyd Wright's death in 1959, the committee visited Taliesin. The visit inspired a talk by Robert Englehart on distinctive approaches to teaching, and he suggested that Frank Lloyd Wright was an example of the mythical teacher because he developed a methodology according to exhortation and example, noting, his teaching as well as the origins of his own knowledge are mysterious. MoMA's exhibitions about pedagogical models, for example, this preliminary course of the Bauhaus in 1941, or exhibits on teaching techniques in 1947, or teachers as creative artists in 1943, were often timed to coincide with these committee meetings. But it was really through laboratory-like experiments, let's say, they also made these sort of hands-on pieces that you could use, but it was also through laboratory-like experiments that MICA realized new practices of art education, which with great attention to the design of the environment as much as the approach to the teacher. Engaging people with the processes of art making was the goal of developing people's individual creativity and distinguished his approach from more traditional museum education. His first dedicated space for education, the Young People's Gallery in 1937, was an educational experiment aimed to make the museum's collections more accessible to New York City public and private schools, and he also articulated more racially and economically and diverse populations, as well as stating about more accessible for people of all disabilities. So the space that he designed had unique furniture with special features to maximize flexibility, and he worked with 10 schools to develop exhibitions like modern architecture and materials and how artists changed them. The space was dedicated within the museum to provide a place for children in an adult museum to communicate ideas and activities of the Department of Education and to bring new experiments in art education to parents, teachers, and the general public. Exhibitions chosen and installed by students were from the collection, and other sources were mounted, as well as demonstrations by artists and among other activities. They also he actually developed traveling kits and interactive educational experiences that became a new way to reach new audiences in schools and communities, and like this one, which is an urban planning kit. You can see how beautifully designed they were. The Second World War brought about expansion of educational initiatives. The War Veterans Art Center started as a small pilot and was in full operation from 1944 to 1948 as part of a larger museum-wide initiative. MICA was really pioneering the best ways the most effective ways of bringing about, through art, the readjustment of the veteran to civilian life. He insisted on distinguishing the curriculum from art therapy with the expectation that the veterans who were taught would develop their own aptitude rather than be a craft project or a simple diversion. And many of them did go on to careers in the arts as well. By 1949, and this is Annie Albers teaching on the left, she's teaching weaving. By 1949, the program was reconceived as a People's Art Center, in essence a laboratory for teaching adults and children, and each semester classes were attended once a week by nearly 800 children and young people and 500 adults, and the classes were in 15-week-long sessions, so they were very intense. The education department had an impressive array of studio space on 2 floors in the 21st West 53rd building, designed by DeMico and Philip Johnson, and some actually had two-way mirrors so training instructors could observe what was going on in the teaching in the classroom. For DeMico, teaching was the ultimate form. Educating teachers, hiring teachers who embodied a reflective creative practice was really central. He described the qualifications as, the center seeks its teachers a warm human attitude, an inspired feeling towards the arts, a respect for individuality, and a devotion to excellence of design and craftsmanship. He described the children's classes as founded on the most recent psychological research and creative methods of instruction, with guidance from trained teachers, all of whom use the same basic philosophy and techniques based on the evident and discoverable needs of the child, his concepts and interests. And family classes were to help parents understand their role in creative development of their own children. For adults, the teaching methods were organized to make students sensitive and aware of the fundamentals of art, line, texture, structure, and composition as an integral part of their own expression. And instructors in the People's Art Center included Joseph and Annie Albers, Robert Indiana, Ada Louise Huxtable, Saul LeWitt, Charles Alston, Eugene Grigsby Jr., and students such as Robert Ryman, Jean-Michel Basquiat, Barbara Walters, and Adrian Piper, I just learned. The art barge is a World War I Navy barge, beached and expanded to a second story and a deck with panoramic views on Napeague Harbor with views of the Atlantic Ocean. Originally named Kearsarge, Native American for Place of Heaven, it became an outpost for MoMA's summer programs and fostered a community of painters inspired by the natural setting. And designed by D'Amico, it still exists today with an evolving community of students under the auspices of the Victor D'Amico Institute. When D'Amico designed annual art carnivals for children at the museums, each was a new and imaginative experience or iteration, yet there were consistencies to the pedagogical design. A child-sized enchanted gate allowed only children to pass through the space. A motivational space, often theatrically lit, featured artworks and things to touch and explore, like games and activities that sensitized the child. This was followed by a studio space, designed specifically to inspire creativity. These art carnivals traveled internationally with the support of the U.S. Trade Department. I love this one because who doesn't love nuns with children, with great wimples? This one is from Barcelona in the late 50s, Milan, and actually traveled around India at the invitation of Indira Gandhi for a whole month in a portable carnival that he designed. It also was at the Brussels World's Fair for 6 months in the American Pavilion. It also inspired 2 seasons of television series Through the Enchanted Gate on WNBC, which modeled creative teaching methods for parents and children in homes in New York and across the nation. So in 1969, the Art Carnival was established in Harlem under the direction of Betty Blanton Taylor, one of the founders of the Studio Museum, and the Columbia University's Art Gallery is about to open a show of her, so if you have a chance, do go and see it. Continued on that legacy. D'Amico retired in 1969, and MoMA's Department of Education was shut down in 1970, with the chairman of the Board of Trustees concluding that the original experiment, starting in 1939, had finished. A final tribute exhibition, Pioneering in Art Education, was held at that time. D'Amico summarized his life's work as this. Whenever I'm asked what kind of art I produce, my answer is that I paint, I make stabiles and kinetic constructions, I do photography and explore strobo light experiments, and I do electrical experiments. This is what every art teacher should do if he is in tune with the times and hopes to offer his students enrichment they deserve. But as for my own works of art, they are people. I produce creative people. Influential thinkers and teachers often see their teaching as secondary and an extension of their work that ensures their legacy. My colleague Sarah Torres made this observation. Frank Lloyd Wright, on occasion referred to his apprentices as my staff. For Joseph Elbers, teaching made him a wider and deeper and fuller artist. But for D'Amico, the people were his work of art. Today, we hope with the opening of the People's Art a People Studio, and we tested that name, and they loved the name even after all of these years. The idea of People's resonates. That we made it actually not apart from the museum, but adjacent to the galleries, and we hope it will set the stage for people to discover their own creativity and foster community of learners that return to the museum time and again. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. I love D'Amico saying, I produce creative people, because I guess that's what deans of art schools like to think that we do. I'm going to shift gears a little bit from my colleagues in these fantastic historical presentations, and I'm not really going to try to respond to them directly. I'm just going to talk about what we do now in art schools, and I think you'll see the connections are so organic. Is this bouncing, the sound? Is it okay? Okay. So I thought I'd start by saying, like, how did I end up heading art schools? You know, how did that even happen to my life? Because all I ever wanted to do was be a writer, and then all I ever wanted to do was get a PhD in literature and write about literature. But my life took a very different course, and I think historically it actually has quite a bit to do with this, which is that everything that we've been talking about tonight, which is I went to State University of New York at Buffalo to study English and become a writer and an English literature professor. And unbeknownst to me, because I was very young and I didn't understand the history, Charles Olson, who was at Black Mountain, was the rector of Black Mountain College, had actually established the English department at SUNY Buffalo and had brought with him several Black Mountain people, including Robert Creeley and Robert Duncan and Ed Dorn, and was followed there with all the beat poets. So the pedagogy of that program actually was not unlike Black Mountain College. It wasn't like a traditional English department in any way. What was really important there was creativity and originality and ideas. I really understood this when I went to graduate school to get a PhD at the University of California in San Diego, and I realized I had no idea at all how to write a research paper or do any of the kinds of things that were expected, but I absolutely knew how to generate new ideas. That's what I was good at. But I didn't have that traditional education. So then it was not surprising that many years later I went to Chicago and I became a journalist, and I came to Chicago to start a newspaper and really fell in love with Chicago. Once again, not really understanding what I was loving so much about Chicago, a place where Mies van der Rohe had been had started the architecture school at IIT, where Louis Sullivan and Frank Lloyd Wright had built such fantastic environments, a city that was so obsessed when I got there with design and architecture in a way, honestly, truthfully, I've never seen in New York. I've never seen people talk about architecture the way they talk about it, and they care about the way they do in Chicago. So this is to say that ideas, sometimes at a very unconscious level, are permeating our environments, influencing the way in which we understand the world, and we don't even know that until later when we start studying and we just think, oh my goodness, that's why I liked it so much. So it was inevitable for me in some ways that I would end up in an art school environment, which was a very radical environment, very different than the pedagogy of a university. So I thought I would just talk a little bit about what we do and what we care about at art schools, in my version of it anyway. So this is what I think we care about, and I think you'll see the relationship to so much of what has been said here tonight. First, I think that we care about the developing of individual talent and vision and desire above everything else. That basic skills and techniques for art making in my school, we have film, visual art, theater, and writing, basic techniques need to be taught by artists to artists. That's a basic premise. Working artists teach other artists through a process of what really I think we can call transmission. It's almost an alchemical notion that the way that artists communicate to other artists, the way that artists make another generation of artists, is through the transmission of what it means to actually be an artist, which is a very hard thing to quantify and very difficult to talk about. But being an artist is really a commitment, not just to a practice, but to an entire life. It's a whole lifestyle and a whole approach to the world. And it's an approach to the world that we hope pedagogically that students will learn for an entire lifetime. We care about community and community in the proximity of artists to each other, a community of people working together. Now, this community also has nothing to do with age. At the Art Institute of Chicago, we had a thing called the Saturday School, which people like Laurie Anderson and every other creative person who grew up in Chicago ended up going to the Saturday School. And what was so extraordinary about the Saturday School was that it was all ages from 5 to 25 or 35 or 50, all making art together. There's no notion that creativity has an age limit, or that you have to develop a certain amount, you have to have a certain amount of education under your belt to actually be an artist or to be creative. And in fact, there's a lot of envy often with artists with children, because children are completely free of all the predispositions and all the inhibitions and everything else that we internalize as grown-ups. They don't know what they're not supposed to do, so they do it. And there's a lot of envy of that. We create something which I would call, in Winnicott's terms, a holding environment. The same as one might think about in psychoanalysis, an environment that's completely safe, where one can go into the world of dreams, into the world of the unconscious, and feel that there's no threat at any time, that one can have that permission. And within that holding environment, we really believe in risk. And I think you really saw this talking about Buckminster Fuller and the geodesic dome. It wasn't even such an issue whether it would collapse or not. That wasn't the important thing. The important thing was to try it, was to make it happen. Eventually, it will succeed. But if you don't give it a try, then you'll never know. And you have to, the same with materiality. So the notion of risk and a real belief in failure. I spent a lot of time in places like Davos and such, and talking to people about art and the importance of art. And business people love to talk about failure. They talk about it all the time. We encourage failure. We encourage risk. It's not really true. They don't want to fail. They can't afford to fail. Really, they can't afford to fail. They have to succeed. But we actually encourage failure and really believe that if students come into an art environment, into an art school environment, and they leave making the same work that they came in making, only a little bit better, that we truly have failed as an institution, because we haven't pushed them in some way that would make them take a risk, which would make them break with whatever they came in conceptually doing. They're going to do something else. So all of these models, the Black Mountain College model, the Taliesin model, also have this notion of trying things that you've never tried before. And we also believe, and we accept, that the journey of creative people will be very circuitous. It will not be a direct line. There will not be a place. That's why at the end you never know what will happen. It's why parents are so totally terrified when their kids go to art school, because they're not sure if there will ever be an end or if they will ever succeed in the world. But I truly believe that if you follow that path, and if we provide the right environment for creativity, that they will succeed when they leave, because of the pedagogy of artist to artist, which is so important. They're learning not only how to make the work, but they're learning how to put the work out into the world. And I've been in two different, very distinct models of pedagogy. One, the Art Institute of Chicago, school and museum in a corporate relationship to each other, in proximity, with a school and museum connected to each other physically as well. Very different situation. So in that situation, we had a standalone art school, was mostly predominantly visual art, although now we do design and architecture, interior architecture, and so many other things that happened while I was there and that continue. But there was a lot of tension between the school and the museum. That was not a simple, and has never been a simple relationship, in part because the mission of the two institutions is so distinct and so different. But what's important to remember is that the museum of the Art Institute of Chicago was built for the school. The school came first. The school is 150 years old this year. School came first, and then it needed a collection. It needed work to study, to draw. So the museum actually came out of the artistic process, that Chicago really believed they needed to create an art school, and then the art school really thought they needed to create a museum. But because the museum became much more, in some way, fundable, respectable, it became a richer institution. Now they're much more equal. The school is on its own footing, very independent, but they work much better together. But the museum was afraid of the school. They were afraid because the school was always doing these really disruptive things, and it could never be sure what the students would do next, and that it might burn the whole place down. And there was that's not untrue, that was not an unreal thing to worry about. I mean, when I was the dean, I say this here now because I'm not the dean there anymore, people were roasting pigs in the foundry. This was dangerous to be connected to a museum that has a world collection of amazing objects. So generated a lot of fear. But over time, there came to be a great trust. But I will say all the years, many, many years that I functioned as a vice president and even acting president of the school, I sat through many trustee meetings. The word artist was never spoken. Objects were talked about, but not the people who actually made them. And I would lean over always in the meeting and I would say, there would be no objects where they're not artists. These did not come from God. There are people who make them and they're across the street, they're producing them right now. I had to constantly remind the museum of that. So it's wonderful to see a museum which embraces, and because historically has always embraced the notion of making and producing. So I want to talk just a little bit about now and the context of a university. So now I'm at Columbia University, a very different situation. The School of the Arts is one of 16 professional schools and an incredible research institution that has a law school and a journalism school and a medical school and a school of public health and a school of social work, and I could go through them all. How do you make people really value what an art school can bring to a research institution? How did I do that? I've been doing that since I arrived, is trying to position the school as very central to the mission of the university. And it has everything to do with experimentation, which we've been talking about, and with both experimentation, but also with this notion that experimentation for an art school is a very different entity. It's not a verifiable kind of experimentation. It's not a duplicatable kind of experimentation, but it is its own kind of research. And as research, it has its own discourse and its own methodology. And that it is completely in the spirit of an institution like Columbia, which is a very progressive institution, that there would be an art school and that it would produce the next generation of creative thinkers. And so one of my real missions while I've been at the school in the last decade now has been to make our School of the Arts really integral to the mission of all of the other parts of the institution. So we work now really closely. Our new building on 125th Street is right next to an enormous mind, brain, behavior, neuroscience building. We're now working in collaboration with neuroscientists. We're trying to work very closely with School of Public Health, with the engineering school. We're trying to really integrate into the process of other parts of the institution because we are also a research entity within that. So it's been a very different animal to make people understand, because art schools are not necessarily based on a body of knowledge and that can be quantifiable. It's based completely, pretty much, on process and methodology, and to translate that for people so they really understand. And I think symbolically, the new campus, the School of the Arts, is actually in the entrance to the new campus, which allows people to walk right into the School of the Arts as they're entering Columbia of the 21st century. So I feel that we've succeeded. I also feel that now I think very much, what is the mission of the School of the Future? And I feel that one of the main missions of the School of the Future is to continue the conversations that we've talked about today, the conversations about democracy, which are so central to the production of art, are so central about the egalitarian nature of what it means to produce art, the fact that it's non-hierarchical and doesn't believe in the master. I mean, here we have models of where there were certain master teachers, but in the contemporary world of art making, we don't think that way quite anymore. But to use the public space of an art school as a place to have those conversations about democracy. And I think it's also one of the functions, and we're seeing it right now, that a museum can also serve, which is to have those conversations. We've spent a lot of years in the art world and in the art making world, taking apart the world, articulating the notion of difference, of race and class and gender, global, and now we're trying to bring it all back together under the conversation of democracy. So the future of an art school is to help generate students who can have those conversations, who understand their place, and who think about social practice. So I'm going to stop right there. Thank you.
Wow, amazing. I have been schooled. So cool to hear all these ideas. We don't have a whole lot of time left, but we do have time for some questions. I have some questions for each of you, and we want to have some time for questions from the audience. And awaiting for us upstairs are some drinks. In the actual People's studio, you can get wasted. in the People's Studio and do SketchUp on computers and stuff. So that's really great. So I picked a couple of pictures, and you can see them. I was so excited hearing the scholarship and the research and the ideas, and I was reading all of your work earlier today, and I wanted you to take me there. So I picked this picture from Taliesin, because that guy is so amazing. I can't tell whether he's like going to the gym or he's at a gulag, but I want to know what was the experience of being a student at Taliesin? What was this guy's life like? Like, what was he learning to do? You're on.
The first one is time to figure it out. Okay. Yeah, I debated putting this one in the PowerPoint, and I realized no, I should not have. The first thing that comes to my mind in the context of this conversation is Johannes Itten with his shaved head at the Bauhaus, given like the hair here. So as I mentioned at the beginning, I'm a bit of an imposter in that I didn't go to Taliesin, and as Wendy mentioned, the actual sort of day-to-day practicalities of what happened in terms of education is a bit mysterious. And I think that one of the reasons why, I mean, even if you saw that schedule, which again was sort of an idealized schedule that was put on exhibition in 1956, the act of actually designing was only one small part of the day. A lot of it was socializing, it was cooking, it was learning all these other aspects of life that Wright saw as integrated. So here, obviously, this person is engaged in some form of, we don't even know if it is construction, or is it deconstruction, or gardening or something. I mean, he's near stones, but that doesn't necessarily mean he's building a building per se. But I think the ambiguity speaks to the ambiguity of, I mean, if you want to even call it a curriculum, might be a challenge. And I think part of that stems from the do-it-yourself nature that Frank Lloyd Wright, I mean, was always a champion of the sovereignty of the individual, but in a community. So it's not always the individual, out for his own sake against the community. It's the individual within the community. I think this is very important for the conversations about democracy and social practice. These are the ones that we're having now. And so a lot of this was about learning from your peers, learning from those higher up from you, doing it yourself, which I think makes any sort of trying to outline a specific set of lessons that maybe you would have at the Bauhaus with the preliminary course, like certain exercises.
Right,
it
seems like Taliesin might be the farthest from what we would call an art school today.
Right. Like it's a much less formal school
out there in terms of a pedagogical notion or student-centered experience. I have a picture of Joseph Albers. What is happening here? What is going on? It definitely seems like the master orchestrating the students as a body politic of some sort. You want to tell us what's happening?
Yeah, I mean, I've always loved this image for the sense of the rigidity and the sort of dogmatism. Like everybody's got to get the right angle. But I think for Albers, and I think this is what's hard to generalize about Black Mountain, because in seeing those, just quickly running through the 3 case studies, you can see 3 very different approaches to teaching and how productive they were for students. Something like the Albers method, you have Rauschenberg saying that this kind of order was really, really productive for understanding what it is you're doing as an artist. You're not just doing something in a very vague sense, you're actually understanding material in its appearance and its form so that you can creatively re-articulate the world. And that's something that I think as an art historian, as a critic, and I think as an art spectator, has been one of the greatest lessons of Black Mountain and the sort of Bauhaus project coming to Black Mountain, is that you really have to understand, again, material and appearance so that you don't just mindlessly reproduce the world as it exists, but you actually can have a creative stake in re-articulating that. So this seems like a kind of like repetition, And in Albers' career, you could imagine as the kind of monumental project of repetition. I mean, like thousands of homages to the square or whatever. But in this is this sort of subtlety of difference in each experiment, each artwork, each of his lessons being a sort of, for him, a kind of laboratory study that triggers the next thing. And so it's really a kind of serial practice of building up a basis of seeing the world again and sort of sloughing off the crust of habit. So I think it's, there's the kind of Prussian, like order here, and then there's this other possibility of sort of thinking that's the careful study of the world is what actually can break you out of its repetitions and its predilection to sort of organize the world through habit. But only if you sort of rehearse very well. And I think of this, I mean, I go to Black Mountain and I spent a lot of time as a child there without knowing about Black Mountain College. I go to Black Mountain now for music-related stuff. And even though it's like Appalachian, I play the banjo and whatever, it's like you still have to practice, right? You still have to like do, like maybe it's because the banjo is like a really like pattern-oriented, instrument, but it's just, you get to the kind of freedom through a kind of study. And you can't, originality and creativity only come through discipline for Albers.
Yeah, I mean, when I look at the Albers, I love discipline and skill, and I think that's really great. And I think often art education, especially for children, is taught as something completely free and outside of judgment, and it's all about the personal experience. But when a child learns music, you actually have to do scales. And so that brings me to this amazing image, a children's classroom without the children, so it all looks neat and perfect. I just love this, and I love how he designed the different stools for different sizes of people, and one of the children said it was like going to a Christmas party, right? So tell us how this inspired what is upstairs now, which is this incredible, inviting environment for creating art and design.
Yeah, that was actually one of somebody in our primetime program, which is for people 65 plus. And I got an email last week, and this person said, "Oh, I remember the MoMA classrooms were better than Christmas morning. It was so exciting, and it was, not in the basement. It was so beautiful." And that idea of creating an environment that's inviting, that has been thoughtfully designed for a child. So everything about D'Amico designed the way that the materials would be set up, the type of materials. It wasn't just kind of free and easy. The only adults that were allowed in there were these trained teachers who were more guides, and they would, a child would follow their natural instincts, whether they were interested in making something. There were usually strings hanging from, or wires hanging from the ceiling, so you could create a mobile. There were materials, the roundabouts. If you go into our art lab for children, we have a similar kind of setup, but the materials are carefully chosen so that they're not so prescribed, but they're evocative, so that you could take them and transform them into something. And that idea, or you could paint if you so desired. What we do know was that because we have the TV shows, when we see how it operated, where children would they would have the setup, could choose the things they wanted, and then the adults or the teacher that was really more of somebody to have a conversation with about what you were doing and what you're making and whether you were having problems and what problems you set out for yourself. And so that idea of both the design and the physical design and the kind of pedagogical design fit beautifully together and was really tailored to a child's needs.
Yeah, the atmosphere inspires you to create
color,
art, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And Carol, I was so inspired by what you said about really what happens in an art school today is peer-to-peer education, that you're going to learn from other students, not just from a master. And that makes me want to hear from some of you in the time that we have left to questions for our group from, yes. And we're going to pass around microphones so that we can hear you and share your voice worldwide. Yes, thank you.
Thank you, first of all. One of the really interesting themes I'm trying to understand across the talks is this continuum or reckoning between creativity as a broad category and the artist as a profession. And it also makes me think of democracy as having an elite judiciary and popular participation. And I just wondered if anyone would like to comment on one or the other, talk perhaps about the first part of that in context of democracy.
Is that something you'd like to address, Carol?
It's a hard question because you're linking two very distinct things. So let me try this, the first part. I mean, artists have to learn to navigate the world and to, if they're going to be effective, to find a way to put the work out into the world. So that has to be part of the pedagogy. But it has to be part of the pedagogy in a way which, at the same time that we're seeking to create an environment where students are going to succeed when they leave the school, that in some way while they're in the school, they can feel free without having this worry about how they're going to fit in. So to try to link the two, I may or may not succeed at this, but it would seem that it's all about courage, because the world has to keep evolving and changing. So even the forms which are popular at a given moment have to change. Unfortunately for artists, writers, thinkers, filmmakers, it doesn't always change at the moment at which they put something out in the world which is really radical and interesting and new, because the collective consciousness takes longer to understand and absorb those ideas, sometimes 20 years, sometimes 30 years. So we have all those tragic stories of artists who made this amazing work no one wanted, and then of course generations later, it's worth fortunes, you know? And this is true of writers, this is true of everybody. But courage is what's key, because if you have to help develop people who have strong conviction about what they're doing and who have the courage to stick with those convictions, whether it's form or content, form and content, no matter what, and to figure out a life that allows for that. But you can't create people who are trying to fit into the world as it exists only because this world has to change and evolve, especially this world we're in right now, has to. So people have to have the courage to want to make that happen. I think that's the balance. It's a tricky balance. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Right, what you were saying, Eva, about experiment, and you only experiment because the status quo is not good enough. Yeah, so another question from the audience. We take a couple more questions. Yes, back here, the raised hand. I think we're going to try to get a microphone, right? Thank you, thank you.
So my question is about the ethics of the Black Mountain School and Taliesin. I'm thinking, I know you mentioned that the students at Taliesin paid twice tuition at UPenn, but they also built the school. Were they compensated for that labor, or I mean, it's a serious question. You know, what's the ethics of a DIY model where the students are contributing, you know, labor, and are they being paid for it?
I'll go first as the person who's gone first all night with the presentations. So at Taliesin, this was the year that it opened, and my understanding is it got a little bit more expensive even after that. But when you went to Taliesin, I think this speaks to the idea of the artist and democracy and whatever else, you were buying into like an entirely alternative lifestyle. You weren't just going there to learn about architecture. So it was billed as tuition, but you got there, you lived there, you grew food with your co-apprentices there, you ate there together, you cooked there together, and also the context is when it's founded in the Great Depression. I mean, it's not a small matter, even though you have to put this initial outlay of money, that you go and you have a place to live, you have food, you have clothes on your back, you're also learning a skill, right, architecture. So that in a way was the compensation. So they weren't additionally compensated for their labor, but so that's one part of it. But the other answer to that, I would add, is that the process of like helping to construct the school, or the students in Taliesin West would often construct a desert shelter. This still goes on today, and current day, my partner in crime can speak more of this, but current day apprentices will add on to existing desert shelters or build their own. So the first thing the student has to do is go out into the landscape, try to understand that landscape that they're in, which is a desert landscape, so there's abrupt, you know, water washes that come through, you don't want to build there, there's scorpions, how do you get off the ground? This is an immediate lesson in architectural design and construction. So the idea of building yourself was not just some kind of cost-saving measure. I mean, you know, Frank Lloyd Wright may have said his apprentices were staff, but I would say that they're much, I mean, yes, they help him to produce his architectural projects and whatever else, but they're much more than that. It's a very integral part of his life. They do work all together, and so I think that the act of doing it yourself in terms of the building is how they learn architecture. So they actually start off by building stuff. And this is, I didn't get to John Dewey, but one of my future projects, many future projects coming out of this, is to connect that to this kind of art as experience or learning by experience. You know, when you build the model barn and it falls down is when you start learning the physics of how it all works. So it wasn't just a free cost, like a cost-saving thing for him. This was like an entire different way to view living communally and advancing ideas and learning architecture.
So how about we take one more question? Is that good, Adelia? One more in the back.
Well, I hope it's apropos of the material we've discussed so far. Incidentally, the image that you were curious about, the fellow was a colleague of the same Len Yang. They were building the entry gate for the upper courtyard at Taliesin, and this was Jim Pfefferkorn. And so Edgar Taffel was taking one side, Len Yang was taking the other side, and they were seeing who built it first would have the easy job next time. So in this case, it turns out Len's team won. This fellow Jim was on Len's team, so that's fun. So apropos of all of that, the thing it occurred to me to ask about was, I mean, in the process of researching this, for example, the best quote that I think came out of the living legacy of the Taliesin Fellowship, David Dodge, who was one of the apprentices since the 40s and is still living, quipped to us one day when Jen and I and Janet, who's also here, were visiting with him in Taliesin West, that the last quote he got from Frank Lloyd Wright shortly before he passed away was, he said, "David, you must understand, music and architecture are the same. They are both immaterial practices." So in light of that, I wanted to ask you what you think about the term design itself, of course, as we know, comes from the Greek shido, is the past tense of eschin. It means something you had but no longer have, and literally it makes like a sign pointing to a pre-existing relationship that's been neglected or forgotten. So this is about as immaterial as you can get, but it speaks to both the questions that were asked here, and I think maybe we can end on this question of democracy, very apropos of People's Studio, and that is design, what we call civic design, is really different from the current legacy of urban design, and this is something I think internally as a team we've been discussing quite a lot through the process, and I would just hope maybe some of you could just share a couple of thoughts about how you see maybe the People's Studio might be championing this thing we talk about as civic design.
That sounds like Wendy, and you're going to answer and then invite everyone for a drink.
I am.
Okay.
Well, I think what I could say is what we've found with experimentation since the original Bauhaus lab was that it actually, these spaces become places where people kind of come not just to make things or to see the museum, but actually to become part of a community, and they come back. We've actually had people who started out in Bauhaus lab, and now they come back as a community. They go to each other's weddings, see each other's shows. It's really interesting how a space like this can really foster a sense of intimacy and exchange, even between strangers. This morning, when we started at 10:30 and opened up, and every table was filled, and there were people of all ages, and it was just sort of amazing to see the kind of activity and engagement of people across the table from each other who are probably visiting from San Antonio and Wisconsin. But more than that, let's go and celebrate that space and lift a glass and enjoy. It's on the 3rd floor. There will be people to guide you up there through our. It's now part of our first phase of the new building that's opened, and it has a beautiful space overlooking the garden where people were drawing from the time we opened. So, thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everybody.